Hello, welcome back for week 6 of the course. I hope things are going well. If you have any issues, questions, or concerns, don't hesitate to contact me. I will make this video clip available under a section of Blackboard that says videos. Please take a few minutes to watch it and then come back to this. Same for this video as well. Please go to the video section, watch this, and then come back and rejoin the lecture. All right, so when we're talking about race, we have to understand some basic things about it in order to have a real discussion around the idea. Race is not something that we are very comfortable talking about in United States society. This is especially true if you are white. Why? Because if you're white, you are encouraged to imagine that you, in fact, do not have a race, that you are raceless, and that's not accurate at all. Additionally, we just don't have a lot of language for people to talk about race, and that makes it difficult to have conversations as well. What we need to know is the idea, this concept of race is actually a modern idea. Okay? Ancient societies did not divide people according to physical, visual differences. Their divisions were about religion, status, class, or even language. They were not, in fact, based on race at all. Race has no genetic basis. I don't want to learn this. This blew my mind. Like, what? It's a difficult idea to accept because this idea that it is genetic is all around us. But it's not real. There is not one characteristic trait or gene that distinguishes all members of one so-called race from members of another so-called race. No such thing exists, no matter how much public discussion would make you think otherwise. The practice of slavery actually predates race. Now, here in the United States, slavery was along racial categories, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But we did not invent slavery. Other societies have enslaved other people. This has been a consistent pattern across civilizations. Okay, not since the dawn of man, but we've been doing this a while. But typically that kind of stuff was the result of conquest or war. You know, my people came and kicked your people's butt, so now you're my slave. But it was not because of a physical characteristic or belief that those people were naturally inferior. It was just simple luck, fate, destiny, whatever you want to call it. Okay? It's just you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and now here you are as a slave. But in the United States, we had this sort of unique set of circumstance that led to the enslavement of people who did not look like us. And then we generated this entire ideology that supported slavery, this idea that these people were less than people who were white. These people were inferior. They weren't, in fact, human. Okay, and that separates our slavery from slavery in other places, which we've talked about some in previous weeks. In the United States, race and freedom were born together. When we founded the United States, equality was this sort of like radical new idea, which is really cool. But the concept of race demanded that we create these ideologies about why some people were entitled to privileges and freedoms and some people were not. As this concept of race started to evolve, it started to justify social inequalities as natural. So, for example, if I think of people who are not white as somehow not as good or inferior or perhaps not even human, then it justifies my actions, and it becomes okay for me to wipe out an entire group of people, to put people in internment camps, to take their land. Okay, so these racial ideologies that led to these practices become institutionalized within government, laws, and society. The reality is that most variation is within races, not between them. So in other words, I can find more variation between members who would be assigned the same racial category than I can between groups of races. Of the small total amount of human variation, 85% of it exists within any local population. So two random folks that we would say were Korean are as likely to be genetically different as someone who is Korean and someone who is Italian. You've probably seen these guys in the news, or in your Facebook feed or something like that. These two women are twins. They have the same mother, same father, but you can see they look drastically different. Why is this important? Because the presence of people like these two ladies here challenge our very ideas about what race is, what it means, how it works. We have sort of this idea that, like, oh, you take a black person, you take a white person, you put the stuff together, you shake it, and it's a mixture of the two. It's like, that's not really how it works. It's not like mixing white milk and chocolate milk. that's not how human variation works at all. That's kind of how we think about it. And the presence of ladies like these make us have to stop and challenge those sorts of kind of silly assumptions we have sometimes. Here's a picture of the girls when they're little. Mom is half Jamaican and dad is white. All right, let's get some common terms so that we can have fruitful discussion. You have to be using these same words that have the same meaning in order for us to have a discussion. So the first one would be homophily. We've talked about this a little before. We have a tendency to spend time around people who are like us in terms of race, class, educational levels. We choose friends like this. We choose mates, neighbors. This is called homophily, and somewhere around 80% of us have homophilous networks. And this is just something we do. We may not necessarily think about it, but when we don't live near folks who look like us, or the neighborhood starts to change, we'll often relocate. At least we'll do this if we're white. So this term white flight, this is a term we use to describe the phenomenon where bunches of people move to more white areas. White flight is the large-scale migration of people of various European ancestries from racially mixed urban regions to more racially homogeneous suburban or ex-urban regions. Now, why is that important? Because our lack of exposure to folks who are different from us in these ways, we are more able to experience and enact the following things. Prejudice. All right, prejudice is an irrational feeling of dislike for a person or group of persons, usually based on a stereotype. Okay, what's important here? It's a feeling. It's not anything I'm doing, it's a feeling. Virtually everyone feels some kind of prejudice. You can be prejudiced and still a fair person if you are careful not to act on your irrational dislike. How can I be careful not to act on my prejudices? Well, I have to know what they are. I have to admit them to myself. Okay, some people feel like if they admit they have prejudices, that makes them a bad person. But in reality, almost all of us have them. It's just important to realize that you have them and not act on them. Discrimination happens the moment I act on my prejudice. For example, if I decide to not give another person a job because of their race, religious orientation, looks, that would be discrimination. What is required for me to discriminate? I have to have a position of power over the person I want to discriminate against. Okay, white people can discriminate against black people and vice versa if one is the interviewer and the other is the person being interviewed. The term racism. Racism describes patterns of discrimination that are institutionalized as normal throughout an entire culture. So this is an important thing to understand. So discrimination, one person can discriminate. That's absolutely true. Okay. Racism is a pattern that's institutionalized as normal. So that's not one person acting. That's systemic. Okay. Racism is based on an ideological belief that one race is somehow better than another race. So this isn't one person discriminating at this point. This is a whole population operating in a social structure that actually makes it difficult for me not to discriminate. Okay. That's an important thing for us to understand. If I'm existing in a system that is racist, it becomes difficult for me not to discriminate because I am bombarded with these ideas that one race is somehow better than another race. And it becomes difficult for me to think in any other way. And I may not even be conscious of the ways I'm thinking about it because I'm so bombarded with it. Think back to that media discussion that we had. We looked at all those headlines, right? And you're thinking, how is this a thing? How is this allowed to happen? How has no one said anything? How do I not notice this? Because it's everywhere. Because it's systemic, because it becomes natural and normal and something that we just simply don't think about. Okay? It's critical to maintain the distinction between these last three terms, especially prejudice, discrimination, and racism, because otherwise, white people like to redefine discrimination as racism. Okay. And then they like to make this argument that because blacks and whites can discriminate against one another, reverse racism is possible. Let me explain to you why it isn't a thing at all. Okay, reverse racism is not a thing. It is a total myth. Let me explain why it is a myth. Black people have far less opportunity to discriminate against whites than whites have to discriminate against blacks overall. And number two, Black people lack a system of institutionalized support that protects them when they discriminate against white. Okay, because let's go back again and remember that racism is patterns of discrimination that are institutionalized as normal. So you can't have reverse racism. That just doesn't make any sense. The system, if you live in a racist system, that goes one direction, right? That doesn't make any sense that it would reverse itself if it's a whole systemic thing. Now, again, yes, can someone black discriminate against someone white? Sure, if they're in a position of power to do so, absolutely. But you want to think about it a second. The term reverse racism implies that racism is ipso facto a one-way proposition. If it wasn't, then blacks discriminating against whites wouldn't be reverse racism. It would just be racism. Okay, but it's not. It's just discrimination. That's all it is. Okay, so yes, absolutely, anyone can discriminate against anyone else, but a single person can't perpetrate racism to begin with. Unless we argue that blacks are naturally inferior to whites, we have to admit that there is some mechanism limiting black opportunity. And that mechanism is what we call racism. Okay? These interacting social, political, and economic rule systems that all discriminate either overtly through something like, say, racial profiling, or covertly through something like white majority governments redrawing district voting lines that split black majority areas so they don't have the electoral power to vote in black candidates. Or white banks using zip codes as criteria for excluding people who apply for loans that happen to exclude all the majority black neighborhoods in a city. That's actually a practice called redlining. You're probably going to want to know that later. So unless we have these ideologies that support all of this limited opportunity for folks that aren't white, then we have to admit that there is this mechanism that limits black opportunity. Okay? But we don't often want to admit that, because then that would mean that we would need to do something. We need to make some changes in society. And it might also make us uncomfortable thinking that maybe we haven't earned everything that we have ourselves. So a lot of people like to stay steeped in these ideologies that people of color aren't achieving at the same rate because they're just naturally inferior. That's a comforting thought for a lot of people. White privilege. You may have heard this term before, but let's be clear that we know what it is. We're talking about white privilege. We're talking about societal privileges that benefit white people in Western countries beyond what is commonly experienced by non-white people under the same social, political, or economic circumstances. These are both obvious and less obvious passive advantages that white persons may not recognize that they have. These include cultural affirmations of one's worth, presumed greater social status, and the freedom to move, buy, work, play, and speak freely. It implies the right to assume the universality of your own experience, marking others as different or exceptional while perceiving oneself as normal. Let me talk about some examples of this. So when a film has an all-white cast, do we call that a white movie? No, we call that a mainstream movie, which implies that the experiences of white people are the norm. When a film has an all African American cast, we refer to that as a black movie. Like those experiences are in fact exceptional and not the norm and not the mainstream. Okay, that's one example of that. But you've seen others. Think about the literature that you read in your English class. Most of it's by dead white guys, right? Because we all pretend that their experiences are, in fact, the normal and the typical. Talking about the freedom to move, buy, work, play. You're thinking, well, who can't move freely and who can't buy what they want and whatever? Well, we've talked a little bit about this, that Black folks experience a lot more discrimination when they're buying houses. There's also less obvious things. So if I move in to a neighborhood, and I'm white, I don't ever really think about like how my neighbors are going to accept me, whether they're going to be okay with me living there, how they're going to feel about me. I mean, I may worry, are my neighbors going to be nice or jerks or whatever, but I don't worry about it in terms of my race. If I am part of an interracial couple or I am a person of color, then those concerns do in fact impact my concerns about where I'm moving to and how people are going to accept me. Those of you that don't know me, my husband is Black. He's also a professor here at MSU. And, prior to marrying him, this is not things that I thought about. If somebody talked to me about white privilege, I'd been like, I don't have any white privilege. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have any money. Well, I do. I have all kinds of it. I just, it's invisible to me because it is so normal and typical, and I never see how someone else's experience works. I'll tell you about an experience right here that'll really demonstrate this very well. We moved to Lexington, Kentucky when I got my PhD. I moved into the building first. We lived in a condo building where like 65% of the residents were super old people, like on walkers and stuff. Anyway, so I got there first and everything was fine. It was typical, whatever. And then about a month later, my husband moves in. He had to stay behind to wrap up his job. And one morning, not too long after he'd moved in, a couple weeks, say, he was on his way to work. He wears a suit to work. And he stopped by this bakery around the corner and got me some treats because I do love my baked goods. And he came back in, and you had to have a key fob, to get into the building. So he fobs himself in. And the building manager is in the lobby with some other residents. And he stops my husband and says, "Are you making a delivery?" Which, like, first off, my husband is in a suit. How many delivery people do you know wear suits? And number two, he fobbed himself into the building. He's obviously a resident. But my husband says, "Well, I'm taking these to my wife." And he says, "Well, who is your wife?" And my husband says, "She lives in 712. And the man says, "I know the woman in 712, and she is not Black." And my husband laughs and says, "You're right. She is not Black." And then continues walking. Now, okay, that's a funny story, except we lived there 4 years, and that stuff happened every time he encountered my husband. Okay, you're like, maybe that's nothing. Well, maybe, but then every time he'd come to the apartment to repair something, if I was there by myself, he'd be perfectly nice and whatever. But if my husband was there, he was so hostile to me and just wouldn't engage with my husband whatsoever. Across the hall, there was a unit. A different set of folks lived in there every year that we were there. And none of them would interact with my husband. My husband's super friendly, much more so than I am. So he'll come out of the unit and, "Good morning, how are you?" They would never say anything to him. I'd come out with just my daughter, who's white also, and they're just super, super friendly to me. And I'm thinking, I live in here with the Black guy, right? The guy that you won't talk to. And okay, these are small things, absolutely. But they add up over time. You have hundreds of those, thousands of those over time. That stuff starts to influence how you move about the world, where you move to, how you interact with people, how you carry yourself in public, etc. My husband in his suit has been mistaken for workers in grocery stores and Walmarts and Targets so many times I can't even count. He just has a very different social experience than I do, and I have a very different social experience with him than I do with other people. We notice it a lot in restaurants. They never seem to recognize that we're going to be seated together, even though we walk in together having a conversation. We're clearly, obviously, together. When we are at the end of the meal, they'll often bring us separate checks without asking, or they'll bring me the check for both of us. And again, these are small things, absolutely, but they never happen to me when my dining companions are white. That never, ever, ever happens to me. It only happens when I'm dining with someone who does not look like me, skin color wise. And it happens with other people besides my husband. I have a friend who's a professor. We sometimes go eat together. That happens a lot. Students. Matter of fact, that's when I first noticed it. It's not when I married my husband, but when I was a student council leader and I was taking, I worked at a super diverse high school and I was taking students out for different events, and we'd stop and get food or whatever. I started noticing at that point, and it was very foreign to me. And my white privilege, here's another example of white privilege. So I get really aggravated by this sort of behavior. So like the thing where we're a mixed group of folks racially and they seat us in what I would call the undesirable section. It has the worst airflow of the whole restaurant, and you look around, all the other tables are mixed couples, people of color, LGBT couples, okay, loud babies. That kind of stuff riles me, and that's my white privilege. I get really, really upset, and I'll demand that I'll just steer them. I'll just won't even go to the table they're headed toward. I'll be like, oh no, here's an empty one over here. I want to sit over here. And they'll, come over and they're not happy, but I give zero F's about that. My husband never does anything like that. He never even acknowledges that what's going on is probably due to race. He seems surprised that I think that what's happening is odd. And for a while, that baffled me too, until I started to realize that me getting upset is, in fact, my white privilege. I'm having this moment of like, what is wrong with me? Why would, what is wrong with you? Why would you treat me like this? Almost that sort of like, do you know who I am? I mean, really, I'm no one, but, I'm not used to being treated this way, right? And so I get all riled up about it. Well, he is used to being treated this way because this is the norm for him. Okay? That's white privilege right there. And you're like, okay, it's a small thing. It's a restaurant. Who cares? Yeah, it's a restaurant. And then it's 1,000 other things that we don't ever think about or consider or even notice, because it's so typical to our experience as someone white in the United States. Okay? Now, am I telling you all that to be like, you need to go out and feel badly about being white and all these advantages that you're given? Is the purpose of this for you to be like, I feel so guilty because I'm white? Well, no, of course not. I didn't ask it to be white. My husband didn't ask to be black. It's not like you put in an order before you arrive, right? That's not how this works. And no, I don't walk around feeling guilty about the fact that I'm white. I'm white. I'm white. What am I going to do about that? I can't not be white. So the point is not to feel guilty about it. I didn't put these systems into place. I don't want anyone to be treated poorly or less than I am. And I'm sure you don't either. Students who are white and listening to me, students of color, are like, does she know she has other people? Yes, she does. That's not the point of white privilege. That is not the point at all. The point is simply to recognize this kind of stuff and then try to use your privilege for good. That's the point. The point is not to feel badly or to feel guilty or to feel like you've done something wrong. The point is to recognize it and to use it for good when you can. Okay? That's the point. Okay, so when we look at the history of race, various ethnic groups native to Europe were not considered white for a very long time. For example, Italians, Greeks, anyone from a Mediterranean descent, the Irish. So this idea of like who is white and who isn't a static idea. You can be considered white or not white at different points of history, depending on where and when we're talking about. Of course, you can stay in the same place, but time passes and you can be considered white or not white. Okay, so these theories about race start, right around 1700. This guy Linnaeus, okay, he says there's 4 races. He claims there's the Americanists, the Asiatics, the Africanists, and the Europeanists. So notice he had folks living in America and folks living in Europe as totally different people. You got to assume that he's talking about natives to the United States, which is even the United States at that point, versus the Europeans who had immigrated there. And in his opinion, each race had particular traits. So in his opinion, the Europeanists is the European, that sounds so funny, doesn't it? The Europeanists were white, gentle, and inventive. The Asiatics were yellow, melancholy, and greedy. The Americanists were red, ill-tempered, and subjugated. And the Africanists were black, impassive, and lazy. I'm laughing because this is ridiculous. Also notice that he positions folks from Africa as lazy, and yet we go capture a bunch of them to make them slaves and work hard. Like, I can remember as a kid, looking at that rhetoric, that they were lazy, and thinking to myself, like, this doesn't make any sense. If people thought that, why? If you thought people were lazy, why would those be the people you decide to capture and make your slaves? Like, that makes just zero sense to me. Hopefully it makes no sense to you as well. Blumenbach used the word race in 1775, but he classified folks into different divisions than the last guy, the Linus guy. He says you've got Caucasian, Mongolian, Ethiopian, American, and Malay, okay, or Malay. This Blumenbach had, so he coins the term Caucasian because he believes that the Caucasus region of Asia Minor produced what were, in his opinion, the most beautiful race of men. This is a direct quote from this guy. White, we may fairly assume to be the primitive color of mankind, since it is easy to degenerate into brown, but much more difficult for dark to become white. This is his logic. Okay, notice these guys coming up with these ideas. They're also white. So is it really shocking that their whole race theory centers, on white being like the best race, right? That's not a shock. Large numbers of Germans migrate to North America between the 1680s and 1760s. A lot of them settle in Pennsylvania. Don't ask me what the reason for that is, but that is a fascinating sort of thing that happens in history, how we have these different groups settling in certain areas of the United States. And sometimes those concentrations continue on till today, which is kind of fascinating, or maybe just to me that's fascinating. In the 18th century, a lot of people of English descent harbored a lot of resentment towards these increasing number of German settlers, and people fussed and said that they had a negative influence on the early United States. You should start noticing some pattern here that, these certain group of Europeans who come and another group of Europeans come, and immediately they're a problem. They're problematized. They're too loud. They're too this. They're too that. We don't want them here, etc. Right? Which is weird because like they kind of came from the same part of the world as you, man. Right? Kind of tells you a lot about how we got started. We were very much like, this is ours, and even the people who were here before don't deserve it. Other people shouldn't be here. We just want ourselves to be here. Right? We're lovely, aren't we? Lovely people. The Irish were characterized as racial others. They were even referred to as white Negroes the first half of the 19th century. There was a comic Irishman like stock character in American theater. He's a guy who's like happy, lazy, stupid. His gift is music and drinking. That's nice, right? And dance, music and dance and drinking. His drunkenness and the stereotype of like being a criminal. Matter of fact, if you've ever had that term paddy wagon, that's actually like a really racist term because the paddy part of the paddy wagon refers to the Irish. It's the shortening of the name Patrick. So if you use that term, you should stop. That's like very racist. How did the Irish become white after all this hatred and them being this drunken criminal folks, this element, if you will? Well, they lobbied for white racial status in the United States. That's how they finally became white. Yeah, they just made enough noise and like, poof, you're white. Let's stop here for a second to talk about something. So there's this long-held myth about the Irish that they were slaves too. In fact, you still hear the sentiment put forth today. If you don't doubt this, check your Facebook feed because this idea is out there. Okay? I want to disabuse you of that notion right here. The reality is that no, No, they were not. And I want to go ahead and preface this by saying I am Irish. Yeah, I'm Scots Irish on one side of my family. I'm damn proud of it too. I really am. Vikings on the other. But listen, yeah, no, that's not true. They were not. They were not slaves. They were not. The idea that they were comes from this misreading of history. Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. So, a lot of Irish folks were indentured servants here in the United States. Some of my ancestors came over as indentured servants. Okay, maybe some of yours did as well. That is not the same as being a slave. Now, I know in the other lecture, you're like, well, it was under the thing on slavery. Yeah, sometimes it's classified in the same system that we see indentured servitude in a system of slavery, but it is not slavery. You with me so far? You remember how I said when we talked that week that like sometimes we explain things at like a base level and then we come back later and like, yeah, that's not really how that works. It really works this other more complex way, but we had to wait for you to understand that. Yeah, this would be one of those moments. So that indentured servant thing was on that slide because we see it in a system of slavery. In systems of slavery, we sometimes see indentured servitude. Indentured servants are not the same thing as slaves. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying like, oh, being an indentured servant is like a picnic and it's rainbows and ponies and, you know, birds flying around, helping you out with your chores. Yeah, no, I'm not saying that at all. Some of those folks were treated really, really poorly, and that's not cool either. But it's a totally different category with different legal ramifications. Okay? Specifically, servants are considered human. Slaves are not considered human. Think back to that previous lecture. You can go back and revisit that at this point if you'd like to. Okay? Also, being a servant has an end date. Typically, it was about 7 years. Okay? You are not an indentured servant forever, and it isn't based on your race, class, etc. Okay? And if you have kids, they're not automatically indentured servants. You actually have a contract as an indentured servant. You do not have one as a slave. So you see how those are totally different things. So next time someone tells you like the Irish were slaves too, you can be like, no, they were not. They were indentured servants in a system of slavery. Very, very different thing. Okay, I just told you this actually. How the Irish become white? They petitioned to be white. They made a bunch of noise. I don't know why I have a separate slide for this. I guess I really wanted you to know that. Okay, we can't talk about all this without talking about eugenics. Eugenics, this is a word you will want to know. Eugenics refers to a social philosophy that advocates the improvement of human heredity traits through various forms of intervention. Yeah, that's exactly what it sounds like. They're trying to make this like better race of folks. So it's the study of methods to improve the human race by controlling reproduction. Eugenic thought and practice sweeps through the world from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century in a remarkable transnational phenomenon. It becomes this important cultural and social movement. Okay? Eugenics often manifests itself as liberal warfare measures. Sorry, not warfare. Let me try that again. Liberal welfare measures that emerge in social democratic states, feminist ambitions for birth control, public health campaigns, totalitarian dreams of the perfectibility of man, ideologies of race, social and racial hygiene, nation building, welfare state, social reform. You can find eugenics in a lot of those practices. Not all of those are bad things, right? But some of them permit or encourage or are actually founded upon eugenics. Okay? You look into the history of the birth control movement, you very quickly see that there's eugenics all over the place, which is unfortunate, right? It doesn't mean that we're like, oh, birth control is all bad and this and that. No, but it was used for eugenics. It was used to control the population, specifically to keep poor women from having so many children. Okay? Yeah, part of our nasty history, right? But it has other ramifications as well. Eugenics was so big here in the United States that, get this, the Nazis we think are like so awful and terrible, and they are. I'm not trying to say like, oh, we think that and it's not true. I mean, yeah, they were. The stuff they did was terrible. Yeah, they got their ideas originally from us. yeah, their ideas about perfecting the human race and how to go about that and extinguishing this group of people that they didn't think were very good. Yeah, all that was born here. They just took our ideas and like ran with it and, like pumped it all up into a bigger thing. But yeah, they got them from us. In the 20th century, we have eugenics even in our government. Okay, we had a lot of government practices of eugenics. They include things like genetic screening, birth control, we just talked about, promoting differential birth rates. So, like, while we're trying to keep poor white women and women of color from having so many kids, we're trying to encourage educated and upper class white women to have more children. Marriage restrictions. So the whole you can't marry somebody of a different race. We don't want no race mixing. That's part of eugenics. Segregation. Okay. Forced abortions or pregnancy. We were actually forcing women that we thought were the wrong kind of women to be procreating. We forced them to get abortions. Okay. And genocide. All of that stuff are practices of eugenics. We had legislation of sterilization in the United States for purposes of eugenics. This is from 1935, and you can see the total number of operations up to that point is 21,000. Which you're I don't know if that's really a lot. Yeah, I mean there was way less population in 1935, so yeah, that's a lot actually. You can see that the lined states had laws for eugenics, and the black states had laws pending, and then the white states didn't have any laws at all. So you can see that a lot of the country had these eugenic sterilization laws on their books at this time, and those laws were absolutely designed to try to prevent the wrong kind of people from having children. They actually rounded up poor women, poor white women, and women of color that they deemed to be undesirable for who knows what reasons. They could just say you were feeble, and feeble could mean that they thought you were a woman who liked sex. I mean, it could mean whatever they wanted it to mean. And they literally rounded them up and housed them in these facilities and performed sterilization on them without even telling them what they were doing. Performed abortions, all sorts of things like that. Yeah, a really dark period of our history, but also very much tied to race and class. So we had mandatory eugenics, and that's government mandated. So that's the government shows up at my house and says, we think you're feeble, we're going to drag you away. Promotional voluntary eugenics that are suggested to the general population. Okay. So that's educated white women should be having more children. These articles, and we still see some of those articles now. It's a crisis. Educated white women are not having as many children. Oh, we need to do something. Yeah, that would be that. Private eugenics, that's voluntary participation. So the early efforts at getting birth control out to women, that's private eugenics. Excuse me. So all those are different methods of eugenics. A big case that'll illustrate this for you very, very well is the Carrie Buck case. So, excuse me, in 1924 in Virginia, they have eugenic sterilization laws. Okay, this is forced eugenics, right? And they want to prevent women that they think are genetically inferior from having children. Okay. Carrie Buck is a landmark case surrounding this eugenic stuff. During eugenics, a lot of slut shaming is happening, and it takes on a heightened importance. Okay, so Carrie Buck is raped and ends up pregnant. And that pregnancy is used to slut shame her and say that she is feeble-minded, needs someone, to take care of her. And the state ends up sterilizing her against her will. Okay. This case was used to justify the sterilization of other unwed mothers, sexually active teens, and it targeted the poor and people of color. She was the first person to be sterilized under this new law, but after her, there was more than 8,000 other people just in that state who were sterilized. The legislation itself in that state wasn't repealed until 1974. Okay. None of the folks who were sterilized were shown to have any hereditary defects. They were just people that were deemed to be undesirable, and we didn't want them reproducing. Okay. Now, we still have eugenics around. It's just less obvious, less in your face. So the eugenics we're talking about of the past is like this selective breeding, right? And all these policies to try to bring that around. But now we still have eugenics. It just isn't as obvious. Excuse me. You know, we have this focus on prenatal testing and screening. Well, what is the purpose of that? To make sure only certain kinds of people are brought into the world, right? Isn't that what that is? That's eugenics. Genetic counseling, same sort of thing. Birth control, in vitro fertilization, genetic engineering. Those are all forms of eugenics. They're just voluntary now instead of involuntary. Okay, let's transition here for just a minute away from eugenics to the current climate around race. Specifically, I want to talk for a little bit about race and policing. So when we look at this visual here, we can see that we look at folks who were killed by police during arrest according to their circumstances. And we look at folks, the blue or gray, depending on your screen, is black. The sort of mustard color is white. And the more yellow gold color is Hispanic. We look at the presence of those folks in the population. We see that black folks account for about 13% of the population. Hispanic accounts for about 17%, and whites make up about 63%. We look at all victims killed by police, regardless of circumstances, we can see that black folks are entirely overrepresented. Hispanic, not so much, but black folks are very much overrepresented and whites are underrepresented. Then when we look at folks who are not attacking anyone when they were killed, that proportion of black folks gets even bigger and the proportion of white folks gets even smaller. And we look at not attacking when killed and not killed with a rifle or shotgun, meaning police didn't shoot them, they were beaten or something like that, okay? The percentage of black folks gets huge, the percentage of white folks get even smaller. Now, you hear a lot of discussion about this where people are like, I don't know why people are so upset about black folks being killed in police custody because white folks are killed in police custody all the time. Well, let's stop and take a look at that. Is it okay for anybody to be killed in police custody? I mean, maybe you think it is. I'm going to be real with you and say I don't think it's okay for anybody, regardless of what color. Some people make that argument. So many white folks are killed in custody. Yeah, we should be upset about that too. That's not cool, right? When unarmed people are killed by the police, regardless of their racial category, that's a problem, man. That's a big, serious problem. We should not be using the fact that this happens to white people too as like a justification that black folks should stop talking about it. That's not okay for anybody. But you can see from looking at these numbers why there's this big movement around that topic because they're so overrepresented. Like, this shouldn't be happening, but it's happening disproportionately to folks of color versus folks who are part of the dominant group. Okay. We look at unarmed victims of police killings, they are more likely to be minority. The lighter color there is white. The darker color is folks who are like people of color, okay? We can see, again, general population, white folks make up about 60%. Combined, folks who are not white make up less than 40%. We look at all victims, we can see folks of color are greatly overrepresented. And then when we look at unarmed victims, so in other words, they were killed by the police and they were completely unarmed, those folks are disproportionately folks of color, and white victims are much less of the proportion of the general population. Okay? And that's why that discussion is out there. Okay? Who do police shoot and kill? Blacks, people in their 20s, residents of larger cities, those are all people who are shot at higher rates by law enforcement, at least in California, between 2013 and 2016. I can tell you these numbers are, in fact, mirrored in the national data as well. Just couldn't find a spooky chart. These groups are also arrested at higher rates as well. Okay, you can see that the annual rate of folks killed, Black folks are killed at a rate that is just staggeringly higher than other groups. We look at age. Folks in their 20s, their rate is significantly higher. 20s and 30s, much higher than everyone else. And when we look at size of city, the larger the area that I live in, the more likely that is to happen to me as well. So where I am and what I look like greatly impacts my risk of being shot and killed by the police. Okay, so on April 12, 2015, the Baltimore Police Department arrests Freddie Gray. You probably heard about this story. Freddie Gray is a 25-year-old African-American resident of Baltimore, Maryland. Gray sustains injuries to his neck and spine, supposedly during transport in a police vehicle. I don't know if you've read the case. I've read the case. The details very, very sketchy. And some experts have come out and said, like, there's no way that happened during transport. This had to have happened as a result of a beating of some kind. On April 18th, 2015, after Gray's subsequent coma, the residents of Baltimore protest in front of the Western District Police Station. Gray dies the following day on April 19th, 2015, a week after his arrest. Now, is Freddie Gray the first man to die in police custody? No, he is not. Is he the first Black man to die in police custody? No, he is absolutely not. And that is the issue. Okay? Let's take a look at what happened. As a result of Freddie Gray's death at the hands of the police in police custody, civil unrest rises up in Baltimore and protests begin around the city. Hours after the funeral for Gray on April 27th, riots break out in the city. Here's some pictures outside of CVS. A protester yells as CVS burns near Northwest Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue during a protest for Freddie Gray in Baltimore. This is the caption for this picture in the news. Now, let's take a look at this for a second. Does this look like a protest or does this look like a riot? This looks like a riot, yes, but notice this guy's being framed as a protester and the event itself is being framed as a protest, okay? What we know is there are actually lots of protests, peaceful demonstrations going on around the city, but those aren't what's getting coverage. It's these riots that are getting covered, and they're getting covered as though these folks are part of the protest and the protesters, okay? And that's a problem. Here are other pictures. Now, in this picture, they are referred to as looters. Looters empty the CVS at Pennsylvania North Avenue during riots on Monday, April 27th, 2015, Baltimore. That's a more accurate picture, I think. Of course, it's interesting to me that the looters have both grocery bags and a grocery cart. It seems like a pretty well-organized, calm looting, but okay. Yeah, so in reality, there are actual protests and peaceful demonstrations around the city, but these don't get coverage by the mainstream media, okay? Because the media is alternately referring to these as protests and protesters and looting and riots, making it seem like all of this is the same thing, which is like delegitimizing what's going on, right? It makes it seem like all of this stuff is the same event, and people are not very sympathetic toward this, right? This gets no coverage by the mainstream media. Notice these pictures are, in fact, from Twitter. More pictures from Twitter. These are massive protests. Look, very peaceful. No looting, no rioting. In fact, after the protests, the riots get all this coverage, but then we have these cleanup efforts. Protesters and just other citizens come out to help clean up the city. Again, no media coverage at all. Excuse me. This picture doesn't make the media. Now, you may have seen it in the media well after the event, but we're talking coverage in the heat of what is going on. Okay, this picture's not there. It is, in fact, on Twitter. Okay, now it gets really interesting. When we dig into the origin of the riots themselves that day, we find some interesting facts. So, police act on what they refer to as credible information that gang members are planning a purge. The credible information, it's the picture that you see in front of you. This is a picture that is online. Someone's taken a picture of some protests and put this caption on it. Okay, that seems really legit, right? So, police go to a high school as it is letting out for the day. They stop and forcibly unload school buses. They shut down local restaurants and stores. They block the roads. Okay? They go to the school campus in full riot gear and march toward various groupings of students. They shut down transportation. They refuse to let students go home. Many of these students are not local to the neighborhood. They're being bussed in. And again, there's nowhere to go anywhere nearby. All the restaurants and stores have been shut down by the police. You can't get any food. You can't buy anything. If you don't have a cell phone, you can't make a call. Even if you do have a cell phone, the roads are blocked. No one can come pick you up. What could possibly go wrong? Here's a picture of the police approach. And again, this doesn't get covered in the media. Notice these are pictures on Twitter, okay, of the police as they begin arriving. Does this look like they're coming there to just investigate something? These guys are in full riot and SWAT gear to come talk to teenagers, okay, at a school based on this ridiculous picture online. Here's someone who was there watching. They were waiting for the kids. Those kids were set up. They were treated like criminals before the first brick was thrown because, excuse me, after they arrive in riot gear and they shut everything down, everybody's just kind of hanging around there and they have nowhere to go. Eventually, tensions break. And yes, at some point, there are some bricks thrown. We don't know who instigated what action, but this is what ends up happening. Okay. But again, this part of everything doesn't get reported in the news. You can find reports now, but not when this was unfolding. Nineteenth century French sociologist Gustave Le Bon believed that people can be overtaken by a crowd mentality and essentially can cease to behave rationally. He argued that because people feel anonymous, they commit acts of violence more freely. More recently, sociologists have considered crowds to be more complex than Le Bon did. Rather than a uniform contagion, people tend to be involved in episodes of civil unrest for different reasons. David Snow, Louis Zurcher, and Robert Peters noted that participants can range from people who have a significant personal stake in a cause to those who take advantage of the lawlessness of the movement. Destruction of property, lawlessness, broken windows, looting. These are the kinds of images that get the most media attention. They're frightening and dramatic. Images of people burning cars and buildings and beating passersby and stealing from stores does not generate a lot of public sympathy and tends to dominate the way we view events. It's why we tend to view the incident as a riot to begin with. For some people, those involved in public protests whose intentions were to challenge the injustice they saw, their purpose was rebellion. Unlike a riot, a rebellion tends to be more organized and has clear goals for change. But what causes it? Well, let's think back to strain theory, which we've already talked about a little bit. Merton's theory of what causes deviance, he calls this structural strain theory. He explains that this is a result of a mismatch between cultural goals, which are legitimate aims in our society, like the American dream, and the institutionalized means of reaching those goals. And remember, institutionalized means refer to things like military service, education. Let's think back to his category of rebellion. Rebels want to change something about society. They reject and work to replace the cultural goals and institutionalized means of reaching them. Rioters and vandals are, or can be anyway, examples of rebels. And this is what leads us to Baltimore. Merton's structural strain theory suggests that politically motivated riots are more likely to happen in communities with limited access to the institutional means of achieving cultural goals. In short, the cultural goals are held out as achievable, but the institutional means are either inaccessible or of inferior quality. Now, when we take a look at Baltimore, the unemployment rate in that community where Freddie Gray lived is over 50%. The high school student absent rate hovers at around 49.3%. Life expectancy tops out at 68.8 years. According to American mythology, one only needs to work hard, get educated, and then I can achieve the American dream. But if the unemployment rate in my community is over 50%, what motivation do I have to continue pursuing my education? In this case, the cultural goal is still something I'm taught to aspire to, but the institutional means, employment and school, for example, don't provide me with a realistic shot at achieving that goal. Add to that, 1 of every 13 African Americans are unable to vote due to felony disenfranchisement. From a structural strain theory perspective, politically motivated riots are more likely to happen when a group has no reliable means to achieve cultural goals. In communities like Baltimore, where poverty is high, jobs are scarce, and the education system is inadequate, and voting rights are restricted, pressure is going to build, and occasionally it's going to boil over. In 1967, Martin Luther King said, "A riot is a language of the unheard." King does not support violent tactics, including riots. He was all about the peaceful protest. But he points out that if we want to stop citizens from rioting, the way to fix that is to acknowledge and fix the conditions they are rioting against. Because when people do not have the ability to have their grievances heard or the institutional means to address them, we can anticipate that some residents will turn to means our institutions do not sanction. So that's something we have to think about when we start seeing these things in the news. We start seeing this coverage. Yeah, we may completely disagree with the means that these groups are going about to get attention to their cause. The coverage may make us less sympathetic, but we want to step back and kind of put on that sociological hat and look at what's wrong with the system. What are the conditions that are present that are causing this, and how might those be fixed? Okay. I hope the readings this week have been helpful and useful. If you have any comments, concerns, or questions, please don't hesitate to contact me, and have a great rest of the